if you go to the Paris Club today and ask for a principal haircut, and you are what the World Bank classifies as a middle income country, you will not find a warm reception typically in the Paris Club.
When we discuss restructuring, what of all this debt gets restructured? Is there any possibility whatsoever to talk to the official sources and at least request that they consider reprofiling or delaying cash flows on their outstandings in any way? Is there precedence of that at all? And of all these other varieties of debt, which ones actually get restructured?
Okay, the multilateral debt, IMF, World Bank, ADB, that sort of thing, is normally not restructured. If those institutions have large exposures in the country, it is cosmetic, but what they typically will do is open a new program, disbursements under which are sufficient to repay what's owed under the old program. So we don't call it restructuring, but it is a species of refinancing. The bilateral debt, government to government, and the commercial debt is restructurable. And one of, and you ask, is that done without haircuts or sometimes coupon adjustments? Yes, it often is. As a matter of fact, the bilateral creditors have a strong preference for reprofiling, that is, maturity extensions. And really the only instance in which you've seen significant departures from that policy has been in that period that began in the mid-1990s and is still actually going on today, in which the so-called highly indebted poor country, HIPC, initiative was in place. This was a group of, I think, 33 of the poorest countries. And for those countries, the official sector creditors wrote off massive amounts of their claims. But that was hived off. And if you go to the Paris Club today and ask for a principal haircut, and you are what the World Bank classifies as a middle income country, you will not find a warm reception typically in the Paris Club.
You referred to official sources. Can we define official sources very quickly?
Yes, they come in two forms. One are the multilateral lenders. Your introductory remarks mentioned this. These will be the international financial institutions, the so-called Bretton Woods institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and then the regional development banks, Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, and so forth. In addition, there is government-to-government lending. So you borrow money from China or France or Germany or the United States. Very often, those loans are extended by the creditor countries in order to support exports of goods or services from their own country. So if you want to buy a steam turbine from Siemens Electric in Germany, the German export credit agency may extend the credit that will permit that to happen. So those are the two. In debt restructuring terms, by convention, multilateral money is not restructured. The theory being that those institutions are in the business of lending money into distressed situations. The very moment that every right-thinking creditor is trying to get out, those institutions lend money into it. Bilateral debt, however, government-to-government debt, is perfectly restructurable and has been since 1956 for the OECD countries, restructured under the auspices of something called the Paris Club, an informal group of, I think, 20 or 21 countries now that restructure their debt to emerging market sovereign borrowers jointly, so that there isn't a competition among them as to the terms on which the debt will be restructured.
Assume Mauritania, besides the bilateral and of course the commercial debt, also has commercial borrowings from China and India. This is a reality the world over. These countries are not members of the Paris Club. This can potentially complicate things. How would you suggest then Mauritania approach that? You know, this is a three-dimensional negotiation.
Yes, you're exactly right, but it is changing, I hope. Last November, the G20 announced something that they called the Common Framework. This would be a process open to the poorest countries, the 73 poorest countries. But for the first time, it said that G20 countries, including China and India, would renegotiate their debts to Common Framework countries jointly together with the old Paris Club. So in a sense, it was Paris Club plus China, India, and South Africa. And there are three countries that are in the process of negotiating those agreements. This was viewed, I think rightly, as a very significant step, because for the last 15 years or so, as China has become the largest bilateral creditor on the planet, it was not, as you point out, a full member of the Paris Club. It observes at the Paris Club, but is not a member. And therefore, you had a world in which there might be a Paris Club restructuring, then there would have to be a bilateral non-Paris Club restructuring, and then a commercial restructuring. And the tension was that if you did your Paris Club first, theoretically, you have promised the Paris Club countries that you would extract equivalent, comparable net present value relief from your non-Paris Club bilaterals, and you can see the tensions that would cause. I hope that the Common Framework portends an integration of China and India and some of the other large non-Paris Club bilateral creditors into the process, so that that is coordinated better than it has been. But you're quite right to point it out. It is a weakness of the system and has been for the last 20 years.
If for instance, Mauritania wishes to restructure its debt, it's talking to the IMF maybe. How does it go about taking the next few steps? Are the creditors, or is it transparent who owns your debt to Mauritania? How does it find out who owns your debt?
And remember, as I said earlier, the Paris Club does not like to give principal haircuts to middle-income countries. It will do it, but only under great pressure. And if the debtor believes it needs to reduce the size of its debt stock, meaning principal haircuts, and it leaves Paris with nothing more than a maturity extension, very difficult at that point to tell your commercial creditors, oh, now you guys have got to swallow a principal haircut, even though your colleagues on the bilateral side are not willing to do it. Again, go back to one of those two fundamental insights into creditor logic. You as a creditor don't want to give debt relief that is disproportionate to what your fellow creditors are giving.
Let's assume for a minute that Mauritania is hell-bent on not restructuring, at least right now, although its position may appear tenuous to everybody looking at it. Is it advisable, and can it be done, that the Central Bank of Mauritania go and buy back the bonds because they're trading at a discount?
Yes, typically sovereign bonds will contain a provision that says that the sovereign, and in this case the central bank is not the sovereign but acting for the sovereign, can repurchase those bonds in the secondary market at whatever price it is. Sometimes there'll be a limitation. It will say you can only do that if you're not in default on the bonds. The moment you default, your ability to buy them back goes away. But yes, the issue, my friend, will be money. Where are you going to get the money to do that other than the reserves? And so you'll begin to run down your reserves to the point that the perception of the market is that the crisis is now unavoidable. So yes, it is possible, but very often there's a practical constraint in doing that in any size.
There's a question here, and this possibly brings in the fourth dimension to potentially Mauritania's case, and that is Mauritanian development bonds, or Sri Lankan development bonds, are an instrument issued in US dollars, but issued under Sri Lankan law. Mm-hmm. They are mainly owned by domestic banks. Can they be kept out of the restructuring process?
Yes and no. We haven't talked about this element. We've talked about multilateral, bilateral, commercial creditors, but there's also domestic debt. Most domestic debt will, of course, be denominated in the local currency and governed by local law. Sure. But you have seen a number of countries issuing foreign currency denominated bonds, but in the local market, purchased by local financial institutions. This raises several issues. The first is what the Europeans call the doom loop. What happens in a country where the domestic financial institutions have bulked up on the sovereign's bonds, in a world in which the sovereign has got to restructure those bonds, let's say restructure them in some savage way, haircuts, coupon adjustments, and those bonds are very heavily owned by local financial institutions, your debt restructuring will decapitate your domestic banking system. No country can live without a domestic banking system, forcing you to take all the money that you saved in debt service and have to spend it to recapitalize your banking system. This is a problem that hangs over countries like Italy, where the domestic banking system is very heavily exposed to Italian government bonds, and would, in a scenario in which Italy had to restructure its debt, limit, I think, the tools that a debt restructurer could use, because you simply could not decapitate your domestic banking system. The second complication is this intercreditor equity issue. If I'm a foreign bondholder of Mauritania, and Mauritania has issued foreign currency denominated bonds domestically, I am going to say, now wait a minute, I don't want to be asked to give more debt relief than those guys. are going to be asked to give. Ruritania will sputter in response, but there are local banks. And the foreign creditor will say, you should have thought of that, son, before you stuffed them full of this paper. The other way, of course, that a country can deal with that problem is to say, no, the debt restructuring terms will be universally applied, but we recognize that we may need to recapitalize some banks, or, as Cyprus did in 2013, have a complete overhaul of the local banking system. Some banks going out of business, others having to suffer a degree of loss, their equity holders, and so forth. So there are other ways of dealing with the problem. But as a legal matter, the fact that those FX denominated but locally issued bonds are governed by local law gives the government probably more leverage over them, because they are governed by local law. And if the local legislature passes a law, as the Greek parliament did in 2012, affecting local law governed instruments, it is likely that that will be upheld in foreign courts. There may be issues, constitutional and otherwise, with it, but Greece did it, Barbados did it, in order to facilitate their debt restructurings. But that is a complicated factor. My guess is the decision would be to say all of those bonds get the same treatment, but if that so impairs the balance sheet of an individual financial institution in the debtor country, that there'll be some measure to recapitalize it. As there was in Greece, a portion of what Greece borrowed from the IMF and the EU was hived off to recapitalize Greek banks, and Greek banks held about 30% of the overall debt stock, and they had to suffer the same deal that everyone else did.